The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So yesterday I told you that it's important to remember that the Trump policy of separating the migrant children from their parents isn't a policy that Trump came up with on his own, right? It did happen under the Obama administration, and the right is very, very quick to say that. What's important to remember is that even though the policy wasn't sort of invented by Trump, it's being scaled up in significant numbers under Donald Trump, not only as applied to people who are crossing the border illegally, but also to individuals who are at the border requesting political asylum. The Trump administration is also scaling up the number of children that are going to be held in these internment-style camps, some of them in 100-degree weather. And I've told you about the project in Fort Bliss, Texas, where it's been over 100 degrees most days this week to create a de facto internment camp. And it's true that it's not Trump's policy from sort of out of thin air, but Donald Trump is scaling it up, and he's doing it in an even more immoral way than what was happening before. We now have, for our consideration, a whistleblower who quit working at one of these child detention centers in Tucson, Arizona, where he says he was forced by his employer to tell sibling children who had been separated from their parents not to hug. This is an interview from yesterday's episode of Democracy Now! Check this out.
Antar Davidson quit after he says Southwest Key forced him to tell children who were separated from their mother and from their siblings not to hug. Antar Davidson, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you talk about why you quit your job last week?
Sure, definitely. Thank you, first and foremost, Amy, for having me on the show. I just want to clarify a little bit the timeline of events. That first night when they told me not to hug, that prompted me to seek change internally. I reached out to a regional director.
Then later in the interview, he gets more into the specifics of this hugging stuff, which is just vile, deplorable, unimaginable.
Kids, the oldest brother was 16, the sister was 10, and the younger brother was 8. So at that moment, the shift leader ran up to me and very aggressively told me, "Diles que no pueden abrazar." Tell them that they can't hug. Now, this is also in front of other children, other employees who are watching this. And so she screams at me to tell them not to hug, that they're not allowed to hug. That's the rule at Southwest Key. And meanwhile, I'm looking at these kids. It's the two little siblings just, you know, thinking they're going to be ripped now from their brother's arms, and the brother crying because he can't do anything necessarily. And I told her at that point when she told me to do that, I told her, I'm sorry, but as a human being, that's not something that I could do. You're welcome to do it yourself. To which she replied, first that she would report me to the supervisor, and then she went directly to them and said, no pueden abrazar, you're not allowed to hug. And he looks at me with tears streaming down his face in utter disbelief that that would happen.
Antar Davidson subsequently quit Southwest Key. So there's multiple major issues here to discuss, and I'm unsure sort of where to start, but I'll start in one place. Let's talk about the policy first, right? The escalation of the policy to separate kids from parents is immoral and vile, and pointing to this also being legal under Obama doesn't excuse in any way the deliberate effort to ramp this up by the Trump administration. That's number one. It's whataboutism to say this was also legal under Obama. Secondly, Southwest Key is the company in question here, right? Southwest Key is a nonprofit that runs these types of, they call them programs, you might call them detention centers, call them whatever you want, in different parts of the country. And the government contracts with them. And the fact that this is such a successful endeavor in the U.S. is horrible. I'm calling it an endeavor because Southwest Key isn't a for-profit company. So to call it a profitable thing is would be technically wrong, but it's a very successful endeavor to run these programs and to have the government subcontract out to you. Child internment camps, right, in the United States of America in 2018 exist, and they're being run not by the government directly, but it has been outsourced and subcontracted to major organizations. And then number 3 that I think is important to mention here is the fact that anybody at any level of government that seeks out places to stick kids separated from their parents in 100-degree weather, like Fort Bliss, which I've mentioned, is absolutely shameful and disgusting. And what we're very quickly heading towards is what's called corporate statism. Since Donald Trump was elected president of the United States and was inaugurated, more importantly, the term fascism has been thrown around a lot, the move towards fascism. And there's no one way to define fascism exactly, but it's typically authoritarian, which we do have under Trump. It's typically nationalistic, which we also have under Trump. It involves usually dictatorial power, which Trump would like to have. We don't actually have it right now, but certainly that's something Trump would like. It involves suppression of opposition, certainly something we have attempts at, but it's not really fascistic at this point in time. And you also have government control of industry and commerce. We don't really have that right now. What I believe that we have is a form of corporate statism. Corporate statism is where you have a sort of different phenomena or relationship between the United States government and corporations. And you can sort of think about it as government Inc., or in other words, the state becomes the corporate group which underlies society, right? Interest groups get major status and power. We have that in the United States. Government will delegate to corporations activities which should really be government roles. Private prisons are an example of that. Child detention centers are another example of that. Whether it's for-profit or nonprofit is not hugely relevant here. And to get back to the specifics of this particular case, Antar Davidson did the right thing as an individual for him, right? He quit because what is happening at these detention centers with this sort of outsourcing of what would presumably be government tasks to organizations or corporations, he felt was wrong. The internment camps that we are going to have soon, immoral and unethical. The problem is that Antar Davidson is going to be replaced by somebody who's not going to feel compelled to quit. And I said last week, we need hundreds of social workers at these camps. And when good people quit because they won't tolerate the vile nature of what's going on, he's going to get replaced with somebody who's not so good. That's just the reality. That's not a criticism of Antar Davidson, right? I understand why he did what he did. But the solution isn't people like him quitting, because they'll be replaced by people who don't have as much of a problem with it, or any problem at all.
And what a grotesque policy, too. I mean, what's the negative externality of allowing these kids to hug one another? Why would they have a policy against that?
I would guess that it's because if you allow kids to hug, but you want to prevent, I don't know, like inappropriate contact. If you allow any contact, you now need to have people like Antar Davidson adjudicating what's okay and what isn't.
So siblings, it doesn't make any sense, though.
I guess they just say no contact, and then that way they don't have to figure that out. Folks, this is totally not a child prison camp. No way. It is fake news. Punch me in the face, Pat, please, off air. But when you put kids in cages, you can no longer claim the moral high ground for your actions, and you can no longer claim that the rule of law is your sort of guiding principle. So I just told you one story about someone who did the right thing in the entire putting kids in internment camp situation, which was child detention center worker Antar Davidson quit his job when he was told he has to enforce a rule that prevents detained migrant siblings from hugging each other. I now have a story about someone doing the opposite of good in this entire fiasco, actually doing something completely horrifying. ProPublica got their hands on a secret audio recording of a Border Patrol agent joking around as kids from Central America were desperately crying when they were separated from their parents last week. There's the statistics which we hear about. Here's the number of people that are being detained, the number of kids being separated from their parents. And then there's the reality. And the reality I'm going to play for you here is absolutely horrifying. And you're going to hear Spanish being spoken for the people that are watching either on YouTube or on Free Speech TV or on our television affiliates. There will be translation on screen. But to preview what you're going to hear, the long and short of what's being discussed in Spanish here is that there are kids saying things like, I don't want him to deport my dad. where my parents, things along those lines. This sort of sets the stage for us.
No quiero que se pare mi papá de mí, no quiero que lo deporte.
It goes on like this. You don't really even need to speak Spanish to understand the gist of what's going on here. And then we get to the really funny jokes from a Border Patrol agent, again in Spanish, first saying, "We have an orchestra here," meaning the crying of countless children separated from their parents, followed, a little more difficult to hear, by "All we need is a conductor." Again, translation on screen for people who are watching.
Bueno, aquí tenemos una orquesta.
My correction, he actually said we're missing a maestro, not a conductor, but I think you sort of understand the general point of what he was saying. Empathetic, right? I mean, this isn't about this one guy, to be super clear. This guy actually, he sounds like a native Spanish speaker. This might be a Hispanic guy who actually does empathize with what's going on, but is completely desensitized because the system is really what the problem is. He's been conditioned to find this to just be another day on the job. And I've got to tell you, if the line doesn't get drawn here, where does it get drawn? And I'm not asking rhetorically. I'm actually asking, if we don't draw the line here and now, what is going to stop it from getting much, much worse? And we do have people who are increasingly furious about what's happening in our country. But we also have committed Trumpists who, in their sort of cognitive dissonance and collective delusion, are rationalizing each of these increasingly heinous policy acts of the administration, with few exceptions. I'll tell you about a Republican exception after the break. And they're going to support these increasingly extreme actions. So if the idea, Pat, is that we're going to say, listen, this is soul-crushing audio, everybody's going to realize it, and even the committed Trumpist will stand up and say, this is as far as we go with this stuff. I don't think it's going to happen. We've seen no evidence that that's going to happen.
Yeah, it probably won't, unfortunately. I also wonder whether it's the job that makes monsters out of these people, or if these people are attracted to these jobs because they can fulfill what they want to do, which is to be monsters themselves.
I think it's 50-50. I think the idea is that the way this works is individuals who are drawn to the sort of authoritarian position that you have as something like a Border Patrol agent are drawn to that. Sometimes they see, you have a lot of veterans, for example, in Border Patrol. Sometimes they see the similar type of hierarchy that exists in the military as appealing. And then once they're in, they get further sort of desensitized to some of the horrible realities of what's going on. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's probably a combination of the two. And, you know, whether you want to call it, do they lack a conscience? Do they lack a moral compass or whatever? I think it's far more complicated than that. I think that's very easy to just say these people have no conscience. I think that the horrors of what has been established as almost a mechanism of government is what normalizes it in this way, and it goes beyond good and bad people.
Yeah, I guess on the bright side, there are people who will take a stand, right? Like Antar Davidson told that he has to separate kids who are hugging, and he decided to quit. But you're right in the sense that someone else is just going to replace him.
That's the problem. Unless you deal with the underlying policy, if some people say, I'm not going to stand for this and leave, they will very quickly be replaced, and you need a much more sort of systemic upending of what it is that we're seeing here. After the break, I'll tell you about a Republican who's actually doing the right thing, kind of now, after doing the wrong thing for many, many months. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show, and we'll be right back.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Frank Stolar. Frank, thank you. I really appreciate your support. We're mostly funded by you. If you listen to the show or watch the show and you say, who is it that even funds this stuff? A lot of Hatriots like to say that and ask that question on a daily basis. Folks like you are doing it. Frank Stolar is today's new member of the day. Michael Juniman is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. He's been with us since 2012, almost 6 years. And you can join Frank and Michael at www.joinpacman.com. Become a member in seconds. You can also make a pledge of as little as $1 a month on Patreon at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I am not a big fan of Republicans in general. You know that, Pat. People in the audience know that. I did not vote for Massachusetts Republican Governor Charlie Baker, but when he has been right, I've not been afraid to tell you that he did the right thing. And Governor Charlie Baker, you can call him a Massachusetts Republican. You can call him, you know, for the coffee fiends like Pat, maybe something like a decaf Republican.
Yeah, Republican Light.
Republican Light is a vegan Republican. I don't know, maybe that's inappropriate. He is putting his foot down and he is refusing to send any Massachusetts National Guard troops to the border because of what he sees as the immoral and inhuman escalation by the Trump administration of separating and detaining the children of undocumented immigrants in these concentration camp-like centers, including the upcoming Fort Bliss, Texas location I've told you about, where temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So, caveats about the decision by Charlie Baker. Number one, this is not some incredibly difficult, heroic, politically risky move by Charlie Baker. He's a Republican in Massachusetts, and the policy that we are seeing escalated by the Trump administration with these kids is widely deplored. Number two, Baker should have refused to deploy National Guard troops to the border from the get-go, right? And even though now he is getting some accolades for saying, I'm not going to do the Trump thing, I'm not going to send more troops down there, he already agreed to do it before, right? And for that, we should still be critical of him. So I sort of have my two sides, Pat. On the one hand, this has been a hyper-partisan issue, right? Democrats and Republicans just have not seen eye to eye about putting kids in cages. Every Democratic senator has signed on to legislation to stop this insanity. Republicans basically have not. This morning, Ted Cruz did say that he has an idea of how he would be able to end this right away. And it's a good thing that as a Republican, Charlie Baker is at least doing something from the state level. But Charlie Baker did the wrong thing when he originally agreed to send National Guard troops down to the U.S.-Mexico border for Donald Trump. And so while we want to acknowledge that he's doing the correct thing, he actually all along should have said, no, I'm not going to send National Guard troops down there to begin with.
Yeah, I agree. I don't doubt that Charlie Baker is a good person at heart, and I'm sure this policy by Trump irks him in some way. But he's also making a political calculation. He's up for re-election in 2018, and he's in a blue state like Massachusetts.
He is indeed. And I was thinking this morning, how does the party, the Republican Party, that is against abortion on the basis that it's the murder of a child who just hasn't been born yet, how is it that they seem to not have a problem with actual life-altering child abuse of kids who have already been born? And it gets back to many protections when they're in the womb, not so many protections once they're out of the womb and actually in the real world. And then I remembered, wait a second, they almost voted in a serial child sex assaulter into the United States Senate. And I remembered, oh yeah, it doesn't matter what they actually do. It matters whether they're Republicans. And this is sort of a good opportunity to preempt some of the criticism I'm going to receive. People will write to me and they'll say, hey, David, as I like to say, it's sad, but these people are here illegally. And while the children aren't guilty of anything, we've got to be tough so that the parents will stop bringing them because it's an immigration wave that is unstoppable and overwhelming. And this reminds me of when people want to talk about Jewish-related issues, for example, and they say Jews are 10 or 15% of the world population, and it's actually 0.19%. If you don't know the basic facts, you're going to have a hard time having substantive discussions about policy. And here's the fact that's missing. Listen carefully, especially if you're on the right. Undocumented immigration has been on the decline for a long time, okay? The Pew Research Center study from a couple years ago shows that undocumented immigration peaked in 2007, and it has been declining overall with some small upticks from any particular year to the next. Undocumented immigrants are going back to, for example, Mexico faster than they're coming in. Undocumented immigrants have lower crime rates than the general population because they know they're undocumented and they don't want to attract attention from law enforcement. Is the issue of violent criminal undocumented immigrants a real problem? Yeah, it exists, and that should be the narrow focus. But this is not the way to deal with that. And it is stunning how rarely the facts are actually mentioned about undocumented immigration. And without those facts, it's very easy to fall into the Trump narrative of fear-mongering around MS-13 members and whatever else Trump says, and that becomes the narrative. When the truth is, people are leaving more quickly than they are coming in, and not because of deportations. And what this gets to at the very end, right? When you bottom line this, why do people come here? Do people come here to be petty thieves? No. Do people come here to commit murder? Outside of drug cartel stuff, no, not at any higher rate than the murders we birth on our own soil. People mostly come here with or without their kids for a better life and to work a job. Not exactly lazy criminals, right? And the most productive and ethical and economically beneficial way to curb undocumented immigration is to help the economies of the countries people come from and stop negatively interfering in those countries, as the U.S. has done so many times before. It's really straightforward. When the economy improves in Nicaragua, fewer Nicaraguans are going to want to leave and come to the United States illegally. And in fact, part of the reason that there is a net outflow to Mexico is because over the last 10 years, the Mexican economy has improved. It's no panacea. It's no amazing circumstance in terms of median income. But as the Mexican economy has improved, you've seen a net outflow of Mexicans back to Mexico. And then lastly, you got to end the war on drugs. That's the other piece of this. So the idea that we're even operating with the facts to figure out what the right policy is absolutely and completely laughable. It feels like it was only yesterday that I told you that Canada was well on its way to legalizing federally marijuana, but it was actually back in November. It's been about 7 months since I last talked about this. And what I can now tell you, very good news, the Canadian House of Commons yesterday voted 250 to 82 to accept the Senate amendments to their recreational marijuana legalization bill. The bill now goes back to the Senate, and they are expected to potentially act on it as soon as Monday. Canada has had a ban for 95 years on recreational cannabis. If the bill passes, it will allow for the federal government to regulate the production, possession, and sale of marijuana with an 18-plus age limit, and this is very likely to happen. We know that now that we've seen the amendments from the Senate and the House has voted on it, there's every indication that the Senate will also approve it. It probably will be kind of not a big deal, right? I mean, Canada has already had legal medical marijuana for about 17 years. This is probably going to go fine as well. We've seen in Portugal that addiction rates went down when they legalized and decriminalized different drugs. We know that legalization reduces stigma around addiction. It will refocus the criminal justice system in more productive ways. It will keep nonviolent drug offenders out of prison. And we've even seen in the United States, in states that have legalized recreational pot, as well as actually medical pot, that you see a reduction in the number of opiate-related overdoses. And lastly, and importantly, it hurts the black market for drugs. And you know, Pat, that people will say, but it doesn't eliminate the black market. Okay, no, but it decimates it. It really damages the black market for drugs, which is where a lot of the drug-related violence comes from. So light years ahead of the United States at this point in Canada.
Right, I think we're going to have to build a border wall across the entire U.S.-Canadian border because drugs are going to be pouring over the country lines. I also think it's interesting how there was such a big gap in between when they legalized medicinal marijuana
17
and
years.
recreational marijuana. That's a long time. In the United States, you'll see a state allow medicinal marijuana via a ballot referendum question, right?
Sure.
And then maybe 2 years later, they legalize it recreationally. That's a big gap.
There is a big gap, and there's an argument to be made that it was too long a gap. There's a case to be made that they've thought really long and hard about how medical marijuana went. They saw that it went really well, and now they're making the sober and prudent decision. And the contrast with American policy could not be more stark. Canada tests federal legalization of marijuana, and it goes well, it's well received, and they say, let's legalize recreational marijuana federally. Massive step forward. In the US, in comes Trump, in comes Jeff Sessions, who said he used to like the KKK until he realized that they smoked pot, and brazenly says, we're going to move the United States backwards, says we are going to start federally going into states that have legalized because it is still illegal federally. I don't like it. We're going to end it. We're going to do everything we can to make life a living hell for them. This is not a matter of opinion anymore, Pat, in terms of what's best. There is no empirical case to be built for why the U.S. Trump-Sessions strategy on pot is better than the Canadian strategy. And at this point, it is people burying their heads in the sand who don't want to see it.
Yeah, and people like Trump and Sessions are supposed to be all about personal liberties and states' rights.
Supposedly.
Apparently not on the topic of marijuana.
Only when it's convenient and aligns with their primary worldview. That's the only time you'll see it. Hey, brutal, oppressive North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un is now more popular in the United States among Americans than Democratic House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi. Remember last week when I said that political partisanship is causing people to abandon their supposed stated principles? And if you missed that segment, I explained that we've seen for different reasons many on the right who before Trump felt that Vladimir Putin was an oppressive authoritarian, Kim Jong-un was a brutal dictator who hadn't earned a seat at the table because of his brutality. And then now all of a sudden, the same right-wingers are, especially the committed Trumpists, are saying things like we should get along with everybody and why aren't we having better relations with some of these places? And you're seeing on the left a sort of similar trend. I've talked about the left going down the political rabbit hole, and you end up seeing some supposed progressive leftists who will de facto defend Putin. I've talked about how some of them end up de facto defending Syria's brutal dictator Bashar al-Assad, or idolizing faux populist authoritarians like Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, and even sometimes defending individuals like Kim Jong-un. We now have data that tells us how bad it is. Self-identified Republicans have a slightly more favorable view of brutal killer dictator Kim Jong-un, who regularly threatens other countries with nuclear decimation, than they do of the democratically elected member of Congress, Nancy Pelosi from California, who, while not as progressive as I am, at least wants health care for everybody. This is from an Ipsos poll done for the Daily Beast. 19% of Republicans see Kim Jong-un favorably. Only 17% of Republicans see Nancy Pelosi favorably. And it's within the margin of error. The numbers may well be roughly the same. But we're talking about a democratically elected representative and an unelected authoritarian dictator. This is how bad it's gotten on the right. And if you ask me, how did we get here? Cognitive dissonance is part of it. I've talked about that with Trump voters. Blinding political partisanship combined with the sort of willing suspension of all ethical moral principles, that's part of it. But I think there's something else that's underlying this. Either subconsciously or consciously, the right is authoritarian. Trump has taken to really being impressed by the Turkish President Erdogan, Xi Jinping of China changing the rules so he can be reelected indefinitely, Kim Jong-un as a bright, funny, humorous, great negotiator, Vladimir Putin. The reason that the right is giving Trump such an easy time with cozying up to authoritarian after authoritarian is that they also have these authoritarian tendencies, and we're seeing that reflected in every bit of data that we get.
And I also think that this is the Trump sycophants taking Trump's word as gospel, because
That's also
very
part of it.
recently
Yeah.
Trump was praising Kim Jong-un as some great leader who loves his people, and he called Nancy Pelosi an MS-13 lover.
Yeah.
And it's just black and white in that sense, and I don't think they have the critical thinking skills, the Trump supporters, to discern either one.
Yeah, my evaluation was overly complex, at least for some people. Some people just hear Trump say it and then believe it, just like Pat is saying. And this is what we're fighting. It is a total sliding scale of principles based on political expediency, cognitive dissonance, the cult of personality around Donald Trump, and what I call post-facto rationalizations. Send me your thoughts about this. You can discuss this with us on our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Amy Julia Harris, who's an investigative reporter for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. For the past year, she and her colleague Shoshana Walter have been investigating abusive drug rehab programs around the country, including some that force the participants to work for free. So, Amy, it's great to talk to you. You know, I've been covering the sort of scammy nature of some rehab programs in the sort of for-profit world. And there's, of course, nonprofit and for-profit drug rehab programs. But you focus specifically on this issue of participants effectively working unpaid at some of the programs in which they're supposed to be receiving treatment. First question is, how did this even get on your radar that this was going on?
Yeah. We started looking into this when we were put on the state courts feed and sort of told to find stories in court systems anywhere across the country. And we got really interested in diversion programs and drug courts. And it started with a pretty simple question: where were these diversion programs sending defendants for drug and alcohol treatment? And what we ended up finding was that a lot of these drug rehab programs were little more than work camps for private industry, and drug courts and other people in the criminal justice system were sending defendants there because these programs marketed themselves as free. So a lot of defendants who are in the court system did not have a lot of money, did not have insurance. Licensed rehab programs had incredibly long wait lists. So courts said, here's this great alternative to keep people out of prison. But a lot of these nonprofit rehab programs were exploiting people, is what we found out, is in exchange for sort of free drug treatment, people were supposed to work at for-profit industries and then turn over their paychecks to the drug rehab center, and that was supposed to pay for their treatment. But what we found out at a lot of these centers was there was no sort of recovery or addiction classes or treatment. It was just nonstop work, sometimes 12, 16-hour days for days on end. And people were just working for free. And a lot of people described it to us. It was sort of like a slave camp and modern day indentured servitude.
Okay, so let's get some of the sort of basics down. Is this primarily happening at the, not legally designated as nonprofit rehab centers? Is it happening at a mix of for-profit and nonprofit centers?
We found for the most part it was nonprofit rehab centers. Many of them were religious. We found one in Oklahoma that was called Christian Alcoholics and Addicts in Recovery, and it prided itself on not taking any state or federal funding. And the idea was sort of that participants of the program would pick themselves up by their bootstraps and work to pay for their stay. So it's a nonprofit rehab program, and they were turning over all of their paychecks to the nonprofit. So these rehab centers, we found out, sort of operate almost like temp agencies, that they have a contract with a for-profit company, and then all the participants in the drug rehab program go and staff the companies. We found that people were working in chicken processing plants, manufacturing plants, doing really often dangerous and very physical jobs. And then they would just turn over their paychecks to the nonprofit rehab center.
I hate to necessarily make this comparison, but it's fresh in my mind because I recently read Jeff Gwynn's amazing book about Jonestown and Jim Jones. So much of what you uncovered mirrors the way that the Jonestown People's Temple operated, which was they brought people in who would turn over their paychecks. Some of them would get supposed addiction treatment from the sort of pseudo-Christian perspective that the Jones Temple subscribed to. They would also sometimes operate nursing homes because of the way in which they operated and sort of being slick with licensing and how that all had to happen. They operated at very low cost, not actually paying anybody and taking in people's Social Security money and other sources of revenue. I mean, so much of what you describe rings to me so similar to what was going on with in Northern California that Jim Jones was doing. And I'm guessing that part of the way that it works, Amy, also skirts regulation and labor laws as well.
Yeah, I think that's an apt comparison. A lot of people that we talked to described some of these programs as very cult-like. We just published a story in North Carolina about a program called Recovery Connections Community, which is a 2-year-long residential rehab program. And participants went there when they were usually at the end of their rope. They didn't have insurance. They had nowhere else to go. Many of them were coming from state-funded detox facilities or straight off the street. And they went into this rehab program, and then they were forced to work for free in adult care homes as caregivers for elderly and disabled people.
Wow.
So you had recovering drug addicts who had almost no training, who were changing diapers for a really vulnerable population, and sometimes even dispensing drugs that led to their addiction in the first place. So what we found, obviously, in this scenario, things went wrong all the time. Found that these rehab participants were stealing drugs from the assisted living facility. In several cases, were accused of sexually assaulting patients at these adult care homes. And this just reminded me of what you were saying, was that a lot of people that we talked to describe this rehab program more than some others as very cult-like. The only sort of therapy that they would get was every week they would be put in a circle and someone would be in the hot seat, and then everyone else in the rehab program would yell at them about their flaws. It would get incredibly abusive. There was a lot of profanity, and people we talked to said this was all about control, sort of breaking them down and then turning them into sort of puppets who would go to work and then turn over their paychecks. And they said that, it was a lot of it was very brainwashing, and that they were open to that because these were people who had nowhere else to go, and they were sort of in this incredibly vulnerable time in their lives where they were looking to get help. And you unfortunately have a lot of these people who are preying on that and sort of making money from people who don't have other options.
Is there any reason to suspect that the criminal justice system, and this could be like a specific court in a particular place, it could be individuals within some of these systems, is anybody even potentially getting a financial kickback from some of the rehab centers? Because you see a lot of mandated and negotiated participation in these programs in lieu of prison sometimes, for example. What about the possibility of kickbacks being sort of in the system?
It's a good question, and we haven't found that, actually. What we have found was that many different states, particularly drug courts and diversion programs, have strict rules that say that courts are only supposed to send defendants to licensed rehab programs for treatment. So that's a rule on the books, but what we found was a lot of times the licensed rehab programs have incredibly long wait lists. They have 9 to 10 months until a bed opens up. And then court officials just say, okay, well, something is better than nothing. We don't want to send people to prison. So they turn to these unlicensed programs, even though that's technically illegal and against the spirit of many of these laws in different states. So we found that it was a little bit more a marriage of convenience than any sort of corruption. A lot of judges thought that they sort of had this sense that people should take responsibility and go to work and, again, pick themselves up by their bootstraps and try to get themselves clean. And the overriding thing that we found in a lot of courts is that there's sort of, as criminal justice reform is sweeping the country, everyone is looking for alternatives to incarceration. And a lot of these work-based rehab centers are sort of riding that wave and marketing themselves as a great alternative to prison to the courts. And courts, either because they are not aware of the rules, or sort of have found that a lot of these licensed rehab programs have long wait lists, have sort of shrugged and said, okay, something's better than nothing. And then they're funneling people into these programs that are often open to abuse.
So how do these programs not get shut down? I mean, how are they skirting what we would think of as licensure laws, labor laws, whatever it is that there could be a case made if a normal employer, so to speak, was doing this? How are they getting around it all?
Yeah. We found that a lot of these programs are unlicensed, and it comes down to sort of a technical, jargony explanation. If you describe yourself as a recovery center or a 12-step peer support center in North Carolina, that means that you're absolutely exempt from licensure. And what we found out is, at least for the program that I was describing earlier, Recovery Connections Community, state regulators sort of helped them avoid licensure and coached them to say, look, there is this licensing exemption, and if you describe yourself in this way, we can't touch you. And a lot of people who have issues, a lot of these rehab owners that have kind of sordid pasts, take advantage of that. So we found that in this program, Recovery Connections Community, the owner of this rehab program in the past was an administrator at a different rehab program that was licensed, but she got into a lot of ethical problems. She ended up sleeping with one of her rehab participants, using people in her program to perform personal favors for her. Rather than having treatment, she would force them to sort of babysit her kids and wash her clothes and clean her home. She was stripped of her therapy license, fired from that rehab center, and then she just sort of almost overnight started this different unlicensed program by just describing herself as a recovery center and nonprofit peer support center. So a lot of what we found, it comes down to sort of a technical marketing of yourself, and a lot of states just have very poor enforcement of the rehab programs. We found that in Oklahoma, for instance, there was a rehab program that was sending defendants to work for free in chicken processing plants. That program was unlicensed because it sort of had a faith-based exemption and this idea that these recovery centers were a great alternative to prison. And state lawmakers didn't want to create too many standards for these types of programs to pop up. They were afraid that if they made the licensing process too arduous, these programs would not exist and people would be funneled into prison. So often it's sort of just hoping that everything's going well, and then these programs market themselves in this specific way, and state regulators just don't do anything until there are really, really serious abuses.
Extraordinarily disturbing. We've been speaking with Amy Julia Harris, who's an investigative reporter for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. Really great work, and I appreciate you telling our audience about it.
Thanks for having me on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I think you're going to like this one. Crime in Germany. What do you think? On the rise? On the decline? Has it been steady? We know about the anti-immigrant, far-right nationalist parties of Europe. They're all clamoring about it's more crime all the time. But is that true? Donald Trump apparently thinks so. He tweeted yesterday, quote, "The people of Germany are turning against their leadership as migration is rocking the already tenuous Berlin coalition. Crime in Germany is way up. Big mistake made all over Europe in allowing millions of people in who have so strongly and violently changed their culture." That's Trump's view. The truth happens to be the exact opposite of what Donald Trump said. We just got a new report last month about German crime, and it's at its lowest level in 26 years, since 1992. And overall, the crime rate has decreased in Germany by about 5% from 2016 to 2017. That includes the number of politically motivated crimes, which are also down by about 5%. But the most notable category of crimes that did go up, anti-Semitic crime, stemming, of course, from the political right wing of Germany. So think about the circumstances. Trump is wrong that crime is up in Germany. The one type of crime that notably is up is anti-Semitic crime, which is the same type of crime that's up in the United States as a direct result of Donald Trump being president and this sort of catalyzing and coalescing and activating of the anti-Semitic, white nationalist, white supremacist types who are feeling very emboldened under Donald Trump. Similar headline from the UK some time ago, anti-Semitic crimes on the rise, up significantly, in fact. And there are going to be the so-called skeptics about this story. Anytime we do a story like this, they want to debunk the report, and they have some very, very tired and predictable talking points. Number one, they will say, hey, David, the crime rate is higher, but police aren't recording the crimes properly. They haven't presented evidence, and that's a totally unfalsifiable claim. I don't think that's a good argument against this report. Number two, another one, they will say, but David, the real number of crimes is hidden because the population has increased or something like that. And of course, that makes no sense because the report is about crime rates. It's not about the raw number of crimes. It's about crime rates. Another one that you will hear from the so-called skeptics is, David, the reason the crime rate is lower is because the police are really bad at solving crimes. But of course, the report is about reported crimes, not about solved crimes, and the police closing cases or not closing cases doesn't actually have any bearing on the crime rate. There is, however, I know Pat wants me to tell you what the accurate criticism is of this study, and I'm going to tell them, Pat, okay? The fair criticism of this study is that some types of violent crime are not at 26-year lows in Germany, right? And that's true. However, that doesn't refute the big picture of the study, but there are many, many different types of crime. Some types of crime are violent and some are not, and you can find some types of violent crime that have increased in Germany. But what we can be 100% sure of is that Donald Trump, as usual, just has no idea what he's talking about.
I have another unfair criticism, if you're interested, which is that even though the statistics show crime is down in Germany, it feels like crime is up. I mean, I remember Republicans during the Obama administration would make the same case about the economy. Even all these numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics show that we're in a pretty good spot.
Doesn't feel like
that.
Yeah, and of course we know that facts do care about your feelings, contrary to what we hear from many people on the right. Apparently, when it feels like they should, the facts very much care about your feelings. Okay, let's do what some people love and some people hate, which is let's review new options for the David Pakman Show theme song. So the background on this entire thing, well, the background is we have a show that started years ago and we have a theme song. Right now, our theme song was created by a great longtime supporter of the show who goes by the musical name of Curtly J. Because of no reason other than we like to rotate theme songs over time. We say this with complete peace and love. We love Curtly J, but sometimes we just want to shake up what the show is sounding like. We have some new options, and eventually we should make this a poll. For now, I'm kind of keeping it informal. I have a few new options, and I want to review the original options that we have for new David Pakman Show theme songs. So first of all, here is the song Contemporary American from the artist known as Chosen. Take a listen to this.
You know something? Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Markin, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. We're going to California and Texas and New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Ah!
Right, that's one possibility. So now I'm just catching you up, then we'll get to the new ones. Another possibility from Art Flores. Starts a little slow, very different sound. Here's a sample of that. Okay, then I've also mentioned that Stu Brooks, bassist for Modest Yahoo and Dub Trio, has worked with 50 Cent, Tupac, lots of people, friend of the show. He has said, use our music if you want it. Here's a possibility from the 2004 Dub Trio album, Exploring the Dangers, another possibility for the theme song. All right, some people feeling that the Dub Trio option was a little slow. And then here's the new option. This is from an artist called Philo's Cult. The S at the end of Philo's is a $sign. Maybe it's pronounced Philo's Cult. I'm just not hip enough to know the right pronunciation for some of these artists. But the song is called West. Here's a new entry that's a possibility. Take a listen. All right, those are the options so far. I know some people feel very strongly that they like one in particular. Some people said, David, all of these are absolutely terrible. Don't use any of them. Others agreeing with Pat that option 2 is good, but the guitar is a little too distorted. Some people felt the distortion was great. That's what we've got so far. And if you have submissions, keep sending them in, whether it's custom or something of yours that you're up for us using. We'll eventually make a poll out of it and see how people feel. We do have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. I got an interesting voicemail about furries yesterday. Take a listen to this.
Hi, David. I don't know if you know this. This is going to be the most bizarre thing you hear this week. I don't suppose you've ever heard of the furry raiders. If you don't know, and I'm sure you don't, there are these alt-right Nazi furries. I'm not kidding. That in the furry fandom that have closed down like 2 conventions so far. I think it was a Rocky Mountain Furry Convention and Califer. And I just wanted to know like what your thoughts are on those. I'm sure you
Okay. Yeah. So for people who don't know, furries are, I know that I always use the wrong terminology, but they're people who dress up as animals, right? They wear animal costumes. I think they object to the concept of calling them costumes, and they object to the concept of calling it dress up. But basically it's humans who dress like anthropomorphized animals, I think.
Apparently it's not always a sexual thing, too.
Yeah, not always. I like that.
Always.
And then, of course, you have the alt-right. And I guess what this caller is saying is that there is a particular contingent of alt-right furries. And I've never heard of that, and I don't really care about it. But it sounds odd.
Yeah, not the most bizarre thing all week, not even the most bizarre thing all day. We did a story today about how Republicans like Kim Jong-un more than Nancy Pelosi. That's pretty bizarre.
So that's the one part I really disagree with, which is it's not even close to the strangest thing I've heard. On the bonus show today, we will talk about Donald Trump's desire for a space force, a space military. We will talk about the millionaire tax ballot question here in Massachusetts. And why is Domino's Pizza, purveyor of truly bad pizza, now filling potholes? I have a few guesses, and I'll give you the explanation on the bonus show. Become a member at joinpacman.com or become a patron. 2 great ways to access the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.